talk this week because nothing's happened in the news. So, well, I guess we'll just sign the program off now.
You're funny, Bill.
Oh.
I just piled up the newspaper articles when I cut the paper each week. I put things into sections because I take 8 papers a day, and I have a section of things to read right away, and then things I can read later, pretty soon, and then eventually. They go into 3 different piles. And then the right away I separate into whether I want to copy them and cross-file them or put them in particular categories. And that right-away box was so filled up this week because so many things are coming down. Well, it's almost election time, which isn't important, but it is important in our scene. In fact, I thought I'd do a little resume of the election scene now because we're almost the end of June.
Okay.
What's
now
really
the
happening?
Mae Brussell summary of what's happening in the election.
What's happening with the election year. I thought I would give my listeners a break this year and talk about all the good things in the news for 1972. Because we come down, everyone says, oh, that was really a heavy show, and that's pretty bad. All this news. I've been putting a heavy trip of conspiracy and government overthrow on everybody for so long. So I thought maybe this week is sort of an anniversary of the show being on just about a year. We talk about some of the good things that are coming down and how they show up in the news during the week, and that would be a new twist. I got that idea because of the news that broke this Monday. It was last Monday on the bugging of the Democratic headquarters by the top officials in the Republican snooping department, and I thought that was really a marvelous way to catch them gumshoeing at their very worst, clumsily and dressed up in their dinner suits with rubber gloves, and the whole thing. I cross-filed that break, that so-called robbery, Mitchell calls it a robbery, into the Republican office, and I did a lot of work on that this week. And that made me happy, and it brought to mind all the good things that have happened in terms of 1972. So we'll go into those. The first thing was the Pentagon Papers, the break of the Pentagon Papers. The story that Ellsberg had was just last June of how the government works. What the Pentagon Papers revealed is how the government has no major decisions, or whoever making them he plays his hand so close that the members of the National Security Council that correspond back and forth don't indicate through them who's giving the orders, like to Henry Cabot Lodge or Ellsworth Bunker. Somebody above there, and it isn't the president, is manipulating this situation. You hear very little of President Kennedy in the Pentagon Papers. Have you ever read them, Phil? It's a great book. I brought a copy, and it's practically threadbare. I love to read them. One of the things that's important in the Pentagon Papers on page 173 is that Diem was making overtures to the North and knew that Henry Cabot Lodge reported hearing that Mr. New was secretly dealing with Hanoi and the Viet Congs through the French and Polish ambassadors, and both of these governments favored a neutralist solution between the North and South. Now, when I say whoever pulls the strings in Washington does not want peace in Asia, it is evident through the Pentagon Papers, and this is just a sample, goodness knows how many other secret papers are locked up. It's a sample of the overtures that were put back, and you were never led to believe that these men wanted to end that war on their soil. Since the Pentagon Papers came out, you see that Ho Chi Minh wrote to Washington many times and didn't want the communists to come down and take over North Vietnam. And those letters were kept from the President of the United States. I think people want to know who is the organization, who is the group behind it. The Dulles brothers are as close to controlling the minds of this country as any two teams. I refer to them all the time. John Foster Dulles, who ran the State Department. From the time World War II was over, he controlled Eisenhower's decisions for 8 years, and Allen Dulles, the attorney who represented people who financed Hitler, he formed the CIA, and Allen Dulles, John Foster Dulles, represented members of the Council on Foreign Relations, the oil people, the Buckleys, the Rockefellers. Those were their cousins, the very rich. And it seems that the Dulles brothers made the decision not to accept the Geneva Accord in Vietnam and just go ahead with the war. So Diem was making overtures. That was in the Pentagon Papers, and then Paul Kattenberg, who was a diplomat for 39 years in Asia, had proposed to President Kennedy that we have disengagement, that the war couldn't be won with or without Diem, that they should pull out. And the advisors, Robert Kennedy, brought up the question of disengagement. There was conversation, let's get out of there, we can't win it. And there were a few people that wanted to stay in, and one was Lyndon Johnson. He says, we'll stay till that war is won. Of course, Lyndon Johnson is closely tied in with Murchison and Conley and Richardson and oil people, and the Buckleys have oil money. They're a Texas family originally. Johnson represented a large block of the wealthy oil people and the military people. And the Southern Armament, he was the head of the space agency as vice president. He sat over NASA and the space agency, and they wanted a war in Asia. And Lyndon Johnson and Dean Rusk said, we will not pull out till the war is won. And no matter what the advisors who had studied the situation for years said, that's what Lyndon Johnson wanted. Now, there was a meeting on October the 30th in 1963. This was 2 days before Diem was killed. And McGeorge Bundy said, my general view is that the U.S. is trying to bring this medieval country into the 20th century, and that we've made progress, and we have to have a military victory to bring them into the 20th century. You really have to look at the map of Vietnam and the situation today with the villages and the bombings, even in South Vietnam and North Vietnam, and the weapons, and what we've done to that country, and realize that that's his version of the 20th century. We have to bring them into the 20th century. Therefore, 2 days later, Diem was killed, and then 3 weeks later, Kennedy was killed. But I want to go into the importance of the Pentagon Papers as we get a glimpse into how our history is written and who is making it through reading these documents and letters that were going back and forth. And we have a lot of domino theories, I call them domino theories, working at home, like they had contrived in Asia. And one of the domino theories that we have to be very optimistic about was that when Daniel Ellsberg developed a conscience and began to talk to us about the way the government makes its decisions on this terrible war, and he surfaced, and he's on trial now for a very serious charge, that the government has to pin down and punish him for what he did. As soon as he surfaced, he inspired other people. Now, Louis Tackwood, the informer for the LA Police Department, who worked for them for many years, 9 years, a black man, surfaced on the basis, he said, of what Daniel Ellsberg did. He wanted to tell what he knew about the LA Police Department. So he worked part of the time for Criminal Conspiracy Section, which plans conspiracies. And he tells how you plan them in the state, in Los Angeles and the whole state of California, and they affect national conspiracies. Did you see the last issue of Nose that came out, the local community paper? Did you read the Tackwood papers? They're marvelous. There's a local paper called The Nose in Carmel. People in Santa Cruz should be able to get it. Inquire at KLRB or write a letter to me, and we'll mail you a copy. The Sandal Spot in Carmel here has them, and I think people should get this copy of The Nose. This 4-page insertion of the testimony of Louis Tackwood. I speak about him on the show all the time, and there's 4 pages of testimony from a book coming out called The Glass House Tapes.
Okay, while we're talking about it, there are a bunch of locations where you can get the Monterey County Nose. In Monterey, the Military Law Project, the MPC Bookstore, the Women's Center, the Jeanery, Cannery Road, Polygon, the Whole Earth Craft Center, Oz, Natural Food Store, and PG, the Camera Exchange, Chili Gort's, Alpha Books, Carmel, the Sandal Spot, Esperanto, Carmel Vintage Shop, Seaside at the People's Parts House, Archie's Gas, Harambe, Legal Aid, Hall's Grocery, the Academy of Music, and Salinas at Monterey County Peace Center, CRLA, and United Farm Workers. Yeah. Now, as to what's in it.
I think the Esperanto isn't carrying it now, but the other shops are. What's in it is a 4 long pages of direct testimony of tapes that Louis Tackwood made at the describing the LA Police Department. And if we're talking about conspiracies, he describes the conspiracy in California that is linked to the national conspiracy. He said he worked part of the time with S11, which was surveillance, intelligence, and investigation of the LA Police Department. He worked in Criminal Conspiracy Section and Squad 19. And that orders for all of these things for Squad 19 is headed by Ed Birch. And orders come from the State Department of Justice, Ebel J. Younger. on these special squads, and that he says the intelligence gathering is linked up with a complete statewide and federal intelligence operation. I think the people who listen regularly to my shows and want more detailed information on the state conspiracy should get a hold of the Nose. It's a very good issue, and read every word of it and underline it. I have a copy of the testimony of Tackwood to this particular group that are putting out his book, but I keep reading it over. It tells the structure of the national conspiracy, the state conspiracy, and the kind of thing I'm talking about, and it's hard to catch it in a 1-hour show. I talk fast and move along, but you can get it in your local newspaper and read about it. Now, Ellsberg is talking about government deception in a particular war in Vietnam. Tackwood surfaced to talk about working in criminal conspiracy, planting evidence against people to create conspiracies, to get certain persons arrested that the government doesn't like, planting evidence on them, sending them to death row, being paid to kill them. And his works, he refers to the organization. It's in Washington, its headquarters, and some of it comes from Texas. He refers to Texas. And it also is linked with the FBI and the Mafia. So Tackwood surfaced this year and told the structure of the L.A. Police Department. And because Tackwood surfaced, Frank Martinez came out, and he's a Chicano who worked for the L.A. Police Department, the Sheriff's Department, Sheriff Pitchess. And he told about jumping on cars and starting riots and breaking up groups of Chicanos who got together for the sole purpose of bettering their human condition. They weren't against the government. They're not so-called communists, whatever that is. They're not radicals. They were Chicanos getting together to better their position for job opportunities and educations. And those leaders are locked up. They're put into situations of riots. They're killed at the riots. They're brutalized. They're completely infiltrated. So Frank Martinez came out this year and told about the Chicano community and the agents there. Larry Shears surfaced, and he works for the Treasury Department. And he realized that there was a plan to kill Cesar Chavez, and he surfaced, and maybe he not only will have saved Chavez's life, but he has told the structure of the Treasury Department and the chain of command of payoffs in that area. And Larry Shears also told about the Treasury Department making deals, we did a show on this, to kill Eldridge Cleaver. Now, this is a good sign in 1972, that because I know that this government works on secrecy. Conspiracy involves secrets. And if you don't know who is going to catch you or who's listening to you, you have to send people around the world like Richard Nixon is doing now. You can't have any secret memos anymore. Everybody can see them and see the deals. He's got a bunch of monkeys, I call them the monkeys, flying all over, because he's in a very critical position in terms of American history right now. Richard Nixon has been the front man for a group of people that controlled the White House since World War I. When Kennedy won the election against him, Kennedy could be taken away, Robert Kennedy could be taken away. Richard Nixon now thought he had competition in 1969. He thought Ted Kennedy could win the election from him maybe, and they took care of Ted. Now they're stuck with a lot of strategy. The Southern strategy has been blown by Wallace, and Wallace lived, and Richard Nixon has to make some important decisions. And he's got to make a lot of assurances to people who've put him into power, who keep this government going there. And he's got Kissinger off in China, and he's got Connolly at various nations, and he has other important secretaries going to South America, and he's got Rogers now going to the Middle East and Iran. They're duplicating their steps. They're following behind each other. If you read where they are in South America, Rogers is going to the same countries Connolly went to. But only certain men can carry the memos to these countries. They cannot send messages like they used to do. Incidentally, I suspected Richard Nixon in 1960, the night that he lost to John Kennedy. He ran down to Tijuana and had lunch in some restaurant down there, met the mayor of Tijuana, and went to the men's room and came back to the Ambassador Hotel, and supposedly his wife and family, and nobody knew where he had split that day. And I called Drew Pearson in 1960 and said, can you find out who Nixon was with in Tijuana, because I felt he was getting paid off before he lost the election in case he would lose it to Kennedy. because he put his election on the line with those debates on Quemoy and Matsu, and I thought the China lobby was paying off Nixon to, even if he lost, that he would be taken care of. And it was funny because 2 years later there was an article about a certain exchange of money in a men's room between the China lobby and Richard Nixon. I have that article. This was a few years later.
By who?
It was a newspaper article about a group of people that had given Richard Nixon. It was, again, I think, by Drew Pearson years later, on the implication that he was paid off in cash by a group of people outside the main dining area in this particular hotel or restaurant. And I filed it away. Oh, it's put way back. This was, well, the election was in 1960. I guess the article later was around 1964 about his meeting some people from China who had handed him cash in almost the manner which I could visualize it having in 1960. And I think Drew Pearson, I contacted him then about it. But he would never admit, like, he was alive at the time, he never would admit there was any connection between the first thing, the first suggestion, and the second. But the articles parallel, but they came 4 years later, the people that I thought he would be meeting. But getting back to the domino theory of exposure, Larry Shears came out and told about the plans to kill Cleaver and Chavez, and he said, there's too much killing going on, I don't like it, people have a right to live even if I don't agree with them, and he surfaced. Now, Colonel Hebert surfaced from the Army. He resigned from the Army, and there's an interview of his in Playboy this month, and he tells of the murders in Vietnam, and he served in Germany in the Army intelligence, Africa, Middle East, Dominican Republic. He was a lieutenant colonel high up with intelligence, sent to Vietnam to work with the special forces in intelligence, and he was almost ready to become a general. And he had orders to go into the villages and kill the women and children and leave the evidence around that the Viet Cong did it. Then we could show them what the Viet Cong did and come back and take and avenge, what they had done and go after them because they killed these innocent women and children. And Colonel Hebert just reevaluated everything that he saw in Vietnam, and he wrote, I guess he'll have a book coming out, but he has an interview in Playboy, and this is something that I can't do the whole thing on the show because it's this month and you have access to it. You people who are interested, you can read what he says about Vietnam and the officers there. And if he speaks, not somebody else is going to speak up. Another officer put a charge against Lavelle, that general that retired this week for bombing on his own. He was tied up with NASA and the space agencies, and he was bombing North Vietnam at the time we were having so-called peace talks. So the government retired him at $2,300 a month. But now there's a lawsuit, to remove him entirely and to prosecute him for what he did. So another officer in the service is speaking up. Then we have Victor Marchetti. He worked with the CIA most of his life, and he studied, he had a career in Soviet studies, Army intelligence, National Security Council. 14 years he was the executive assistant to the deputy director of the CIA. He resigned in 1969 to expose the CIA for what it was, and he wrote The Tightrope Dancer, a novel about the CIA, and he has a second book about the CIA, which is even heavier, and it was a judge ordered it not to be published. Well, maybe it'll be published in Europe. The point is that the top officials, I'm using, not the person at a lower level who defects gets completely swallowed up, and even the top officials who want to write a book can't get it published. But it's telling you where their head is at. The first defection that took place years ago in 1964, 1965 was Hans Tuft, one of the top agents of our CIA, who worked with the underground Free French against Hitler and tried to free Europe from oppression. He's Belgium, and he worked with the CIA. And after Kennedy was killed, he was sick about the American invasion of the Dominican Republic, the recognition of the military in the Dominican, and the killing of Kennedy. And he was took home notes to write memos to expose the CIA. He was the first one. It was about 64 or 65. I don't recall which year. I have all the files of his defecting, and he had an ad in the Wall Street Journal, wanted one agent for hire. He left the CIA, and I've never heard about him. I don't know if he's alive or dead. They use all kinds of aliases and can die somewhere in a rooming house from another name. I haven't heard a thing about Hans Tuft, and I've sent out letters. he had a fake law degree from the office of John J. McCloy and worked out of New York. And I don't know where he is now, but he was the first defector, but he didn't get the publicity or the attention that Marchetti has gotten. Now, there's another fellow who defected this week who's not so famous. His name is Risley Claiborne Papitrici. I guess you saw him. He's a lawyer from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, who worked in the legislature. And 12 years ago, he stood up and was for segregation. Did you read the article, Phil?
No, I didn't.
Oh, yeah, he takes it all back now. He said that you can read that. He said, I don't want to leave my children with the legacy that their daddy was a bigot and a racist. He's a state legislator down in Louisiana, and he was against segregation, against equal job opportunity. And he realizes he's wrong. He said, I had a firm conviction. I would not.
He was against desegregation.
He was against desegregation. Yeah, he feels that his mistake in the '60s was wrong. That the position he took was wrong, and he wants more job opportunities and for blacks, and he wants the desegregation, and he doesn't want to be remembered as a bigot. So maybe the train of defectors will get larger. I keep a collection of people with a conscience that are speaking up, and I hope that this domino theory works as well as the Asian one, or better, because theirs isn't working, But I think that the people that speak up should be recognized, and in some way there isn't enough of that. There aren't enough people accepting the good news every day along with the bad. Now, there was a certain script I felt for 1972 that our intelligence agents wanted, and I saw it working to an effect all through this from 68, from the time of Martin Luther King and the riots, up to 72. And I see a break on that. I don't see it rolling the way that Nixon and company want it. And this is the good sign. Like I said, Phil, I always talk about the bad things, but this is the way I see the script, and this is the way it isn't going the way they wanted it. The student riots at Kent State and Orangeburg and Isla Vista were filled with provocateurs, and the students objected to the war in Vietnam. What happened is the war got bloodier every day, but the students aren't rioting. They seem to, I don't know how they're realigning themselves. They're dropping out of the system. They're not watching the television or using the plastic credit cards, and they're not part of the same culture that Mama and Papa were. But they're not going to be lined up and shot like at Kent State, and they're not going to be fooled by the provocateurs. The students are aware of the provocateurs on campus, or at any organization. They can spot them, they talk about them, and they seem to be more aware of them. So that the student rioting, the war is bad, but I'm sure that the president thought with this increased bombing that we would have more rioting before the elections. And we're not rioting. People are signing petitions and lining up with the government, which Nixon never thought they would. He thought there'd be more outward emotional expression.
Do you think the fact that a lot of young people have the vote is making a difference too?
I think the fact that they have the vote is making the difference, and I just think that they realize that getting out on the streets and yelling about the war is not as important as maybe going to law school and medical school and working with the oppressed and voting out Nixon. Yeah, trying to vote him out. I think it makes a difference being able to vote at 18, from the age 18 to 21. Because there's nothing they could do but get on the street and thrash. They couldn't take their parents to the poll and move their hands. So I think having that age group from 18 to 21, having that ballot in your hand has made a difference. Knowing that you have some say has made a big difference rather than marching around the street.
Yeah, there have been a lot of elections decided so far by youth vote, especially local elections.
Well, look, McGovern took New York. I mean, it's just something that Mitchell and company had not anticipated, or if they anticipated by letting the 18-year-old have the vote. I think they believed through the hysteria, law and order, and the riots, that if they escalated a lot of these things and people protested, they could say, oh, look how they're protesting. But the student riots have been practically nothing, and there's nowhere even to put their old provocateurs, Then the prison riots, they had Attica and San Quentin, and there was Florida riots and New Orleans, and what happened was that the sympathy went to the prisoners. It didn't go to the prison system. That enough people said, look, what's happening? Enough lawyers spoke up, and journalists spoke up, and after Attica, maybe Rockefeller proved himself in the hardcore Republican Party. You know, I always say as if he needed proof, but I don't think the prison riots, the Tackwood Papers here tell how the police department had foreknowledge of the San Quentin riots long before they took place when George Jackson was killed, and how he had a big part in trying to frame Angela Davis, how the LA Police Department used him through the criminal conspiracy section to work on the Angela Davis thing, and they hoped through the San Quentin riot that they would get Angela Davis and Jackson and everyone in one fell swoop, and the sympathies would be with the people as against those terrible rioters out there. Well, it didn't work that way. You see, you had Bobby Seale was up for trial, and imagine what would happen in this country to the blacks and to the general population of Seale and Angela Davis and the Soledad brothers and the Berrigans and the L.A. Panthers were all guilty, and they were all locked in jail, and people knew they were innocent. But it didn't work that way. They were all acquitted. Because, you see, every day that we communicate through the radio, through the press, underground press, or even the ordinary press, and the media, maybe I'm reaching somebody who's going to sit on a jury someday. And they can try that on trial for what it's worth, but if they hear that there are conspiracies, if they read about evidence that's planted, if they read how you hire ex-convicts to give testimony against somebody, it will ring a bell when it comes time to vote on that jury. Somebody listening today is going to be on a jury. And out in Salinas at that courthouse, they're going to want to frame some person, and they're going to know what planted evidence is, you know, and they're going to know what witnesses are who are bought off from the top level to the local level, because we jump around on these subjects. So that all of these things, the Berrigan Trail, they were acquitted, and Angela was acquitted, and Bobby Seale, and the Panthers. So the legal system, even with their prosecutors, Aaron Harris from L.A. that was brought up against Angela, he fell apart. He didn't even have a case. So that is a good sign, I think. Now, there's other signs like the pop festival. They tried to come down on the kids with the music festivals. Altamont was staged by the CIA. They had the camera on the killing. The vibes were bad. Those were provocateurs using the Hells Angels and a group to come down to show that the youth are violent. It didn't work. The youth just gave up their pop festivals. They weren't going to be stabbed. They weren't going to be given bad drugs. They weren't going to be trampled on. So they gave up their pop festivals, and the Rolling Stones moved now into awful places like the Palladium or Carnegie Hall, and you have a choice. You can either go or not go, and the kids have built their own resources. They don't even go to the pop festivals. If you give them good music, like Joan Baez was there, and it was $2 a person, and the vibes are good, they'll go. If it's a plastic thing, if there's danger, if it's expensive, they're not going to go. So they diverted their energies away from these scenes that the establishment wanted them to have. They've redirected their energies, which is very good, because the image of the youth was built up through the Manson, framing Manson, and the story on the occult. And the system wanted you to come down on the youth, but it didn't work, because this generation is the most honest generation. All the young people, or most of them I know, they don't have prejudices. They don't have hatreds of other races or economic classes, and they don't put on any airs, and they're not phony, and they don't consume themselves with fashions or throwing names around. I think they're a far-out generation, and they're cool. They're keeping cool. And this is something that you can't take over and overthrow a government if everybody's keeping cool. You don't have an excuse. Out of the script of the 1968-69 script of the CIA came the cover story for Time last week on the occult revival. This is outdated. This was to tie in Manson and the scare. They mentioned Manson in here. And to make the older generation, to compensate for the youth vote, they want the older people to get out and get scared that we're going into witchcraft or magic. It's not going to work. I don't think anybody was interested in that cover of Time or the occult revival at all. Nobody talks about it or thinks it's pertinent to today's times. What's your reaction to this kind of a thing, Phil? Do you think it's pertinent?
I don't know. There are a lot of incidents cropping up around the country in the news. You know, they're isolated and scattered, but, you know, small towns that have little groups of young people, if you believe the reports, that are practicing different cult revivals.
Oh,
I mean, it's
I think
it's cropping up in the news. I don't know whether it's manufactured or not.
I think they're planted. There's an article in the L.A. Star last week, the newspaper, about Manson, and that if Thomas Noguchi could tell the truth, he'd tell about all the human blood that Manson drank. I don't think that's true. I think those are planted stories. I just don't believe it.
Okay, we'll be back with more of...
Yeah, we're going to go on and talk about some of the good things that happened in 1972. And then I did want to read you from the Pentagon Papers again, the way the government covers up things when they're caught, and show the parallel to the way they covered up being caught in the office of the Democratic Party this week, because I think that has serious implications. I barely mentioned the first of the show, and I want to get back to it. But this last year, with the mushrooming of FM stations and programs such as we have here, talk shows that go all over the country, and underground newspapers with marvelous articles. Even our local community now, the Nose, has come out with wonderful things. If you read every word of it, you'll learn a lot. It's an opportunity for just a quarter to have your hands on a lot of material that's coming out through the process of duplicating machines and memos, electronic surveillance of watching them like they watch us. It's a two-way game. If Richard Nixon and Kissinger send notes out and the White House sends notes on the ITT deals, somebody can intercept them. And it's a whole new ball game, because as much as we worry about surveillance or wiretapping our phones, there's always a chance that one of the people that wants to tell the truth. It doesn't have to be any political line. The men that I mentioned, Marchetti and Hebert and all these, Tackwood and Ellsberg, one comes from Harvard, one was brought up in the streets of New Orleans, as a poor child, and been in jail as a convict and no job opportunities. All walks of life are getting their thing together, and truth is the commodity that I hope will come out and that will free us from this slavery, that we actually are a repressed people, because persons running the government do not represent the entire United States. They represent a handful of families, a handful of people. And to free ourselves from this oppression which you feel, the oppression of all of your tax money going to kill other people, and you can't free yourself to even help them. You don't know which way to turn. And there's a lot of things coming down that are very ugly, and you have control of those if you get access to the truth. And if you hear something that is said and you believe it, pass that information on and try to turn other people on and work together. And keep your eyes open for these people that are risking their lives. And to tell you the truth, Larry Shears was arrested yesterday. The informer who told about the plot to kill Chavez was arrested for carrying a loaded weapon on a public street. We have to follow that to see if they're out to get him now, to put him in jail for disclosing the way the Treasury Department works.
He was convicted yesterday, actually.
He was convicted of carrying a loaded weapon.
Not arrested yesterday.
He was convicted, which is a maximum of 6 months in jail. Now, what will happen to him in jail if he goes there? Was this evidence planted on him? You see, will they pick up Tackwood, Larry Shears Martinez? The conspirators use ex-convicts, people out on narcotics charges or on drug raps or for stealing cars or any other thing. James Ray was an ex-convict, and they can use these particular men because it's easier to bring them back and keep them if they're ever if they bungle their job. When the Pentagon Papers came out, there was a discussion on the killing of Diem and the coup, which I mentioned, on how to cover the killing, not the killing, but the overthrow of Diem without being noticed. And I thought I'd just share that with you, because these are the tools, if you understand the tools and methods by which conspirators achieve what they want to achieve, then when they repeat their job and get caught, you'll recognize the bungling cover-up. Because August 24th, it was decided in Washington, the National Security Council, that they would bring about Diem's replacement if necessary. So Pentagon paper number 37 says that the memo says that the concealing of the overthrow of Diem, the American official's hand should not be shown, that they should use Lieutenant Colonel Conein, of the CIA as the middleman, that Conein would convey the points down the line, that the orders would come from Washington or the help, and Conein would be the general to receive the information, but he was CIA. Then he would meet with General Don, one of Diem's own military men, and the Vietnamese would arrange the coup, and Conein would be the middleman. Pentagon paper number 40 says the timing and the managing announcement should be to minimize the appearance of collusion, that they should minimize their appearance. Pentagon paper 49 assured Big Min, that's one of the generals in Vietnam, through Conein, that the U.S. will not thwart any plans. They will review their plans, but they won't thwart any plans other than assassination. They didn't intend for Diem to be assassinated, but he was, the minute he was in their hands, he was assassinated after the coup took place. Pentagon paper number 50 is interesting because John Kennedy was in on this coup, and 3 weeks later John Kennedy is dead. And he sends a memo directly to Vietnam, and he urges that the covert effort be with the closest security, and the identity be hidden, and alternative leadership be ready to take over. Effort should be made, John Kennedy said, for total security and fully deniable. In the event that they're caught, it has to be fully deniable, separated from normal political analysis and reporting, that the military overthrow of Diem and his brother-in-law, Mr. New, should not come in any other messages, that they should have their own separate messages so that it's deniable. They were to issue all instructions only orally in order to provide plausibility to denial. Now, people say to me, how can you prove? Have you seen the paper that gave the orders to kill Kennedy? Kennedy is saying everything has to be done orally to provide the plausibility of the denial. And he said to Henry Cabot Lodge, all reports are to go to Mr. Lodge alone, from Washington to Saigon. Orally, he writes, to you alone, Lodge, and so that will provide plausibility and deniability, John Kennedy said. Now, the White House sent a message October the 6th, Pentagon paper number 51, that they want to avoid being drawn into the last-minute reviewing or advising on the coup, because that might tend to identify the U.S. too closely with the change of government. And in order to preserve the security and deniability, appropriate arrangements were made with other follow-up contacts. They were most concerned with the security problem, so they confined the knowledge of the coup within only a small group of high officials in the White House, the State Department, and the CIA, whom the message would be cleared through, because, you see, if too many people were in on it, it couldn't be deniable. Pentagon paper number October 25th said there would be a close relationship with General Don of Vietnam and Lieutenant Colonel Conein of the CIA. They were thinking of a cutoff man, a in-between man, a designee for General Don, so that Conein at the last minute wouldn't be associated with the coup. I'm going over this very slowly, how the machinery, these are printed in the Pentagon Papers, that they have planning for months the coup against Diem, but we will have a cutoff as of October 25th between the CIA so that they don't time into Don. Now, they say, in the event the coup aborts, you remember that we will have it within the realm of plausible deniability that is perfectly prepared. The government is prepared to disavow Mr. Conein, at any time. It will serve the national interest. Now, that means that their agent, through all these arrangements, Mr. Conein of the CIA, is to be the go-between between the generals in Vietnam that are going to overthrow the government. But they have the arrangements to make it perfectly deniable, to disavow Conein at any time that they want, that it will serve the national interest. Now, this is important discussion, and if you want to go to the library and copy those pages or buy the Pentagon Papers, people really should own these books and support the people, even the New York Times, because they're telling you something, and you should get behind them and own these books and study them. That Conein all along is to be the middleman, but any time it serves the national interest, they will deny him, that they don't even know the man. You see, plausible denial. They will disavow Conein if the coup fails, but they will work with him up to the moment it takes place. This is what the Pentagon Papers says. Okay, Henry Cabot Lodge says to George McBundy, October the 30th, this is 2 days before Diem is killed, Pentagon Paper 57, we will say this is a Vietnamese affair, and they will tell Diem of this. If they get caught, they will tell Diem about the traitors. Now keep your hands off and monitor and press for detailed information. The best generals are involved. This is what Lodge is telling the National Security Council. The best generals are involved, and Koenig is going to meet with Don the night of October 30th, that night. The CIA man will meet with the generals, but you see, they're going to deny that they know Koenig in case they're caught. They have the deniability. They'll sacrifice him for national security. And there will be a limited contact of Koenig and Don after this night, because 2 days later the coup is taking place. Now, Lodge says he'll take a military aircraft out instead of Pan American. He's switching he was going to get out of town, but he didn't manage to get out. And if there's leaks to the press, he will cover his story, and he has his getaway story printed here of how he will leave Saigon, Henry Cabot Lodge. And he said, I will offer space to a group for emergency leave of the soldiers, and that will allay further suspicions and handle this as a routine matter. You see, the press then will say Henry Cabot Lodge, as a routine matter, was on this military plane taking troops home for emergency leave. They print their cover story in this book. And if my program or discussion each week is of any value for people, it's to understand the methods, the language which the conspirators use. And when you get it printed in a book, it's understandable. If you read the Tackwood thing in the nose this week, if you read the Pentagon Papers, or many of these books that I keep giving book titles about, read the language that they use, not that I make up, and you see how they cover their stories. Now, they said, if in case they ask me, or General Harkins, to call off the coup. General Harkins was the general representing the United States who was against the coup all along. And in case they asked him to call it off, they will not. They said, our story will be, we can't call it off, that Mr. Lodge has made a deal, and planned ahead of time. If they call me, I will say, I can't call it off, that you're the commander-in-chief, and I don't know what to do. I can't call off the coup. You're in charge of your army. I can't call it off. So Lodge had his story all covered. Then he said, the Pentagon Papers said, we're going to need extra money to buy off opposition. Send money, because some of the generals were loyal to Diem. So the American taxpayer money will have to go swiftly into the hands of the generals who are opposing the coup, or maybe who will speak up. They're going to give money to those generals really quick. And then if coup fails, the message says if the coup fails, somebody will blame American complicity, and we have to say that we had no part in it. A miscalculation could jeopardize all of our position in Southeast Asia, and it's a big risk, but we're going to go ahead and do it. Now, the Pentagon paper number 59, dated November the 1st, Diem called Henry Cabot Lodge, and he says there's a rebellion outside the palace. What is the attitude of the United States? And Lodge says, I don't feel well enough informed to tell you. It's 4:30 in the morning. He's been planning this for months. See? Diem says, but you have some general idea. I've tried to do my duty. And Lodge says, well, you certainly have done your duty, and I admire your courage. No one can take that away from you. And I hear there's current activity out there, and they've offered you, and your brother's safe conduct. And Diem says, do you have my phone number? And Lodge says, yes. If I can do anything for your safety, physical safety, call me on the phone. And then Diem was taken off, and he was murdered in a truck. Pentagon Paper 59, November the 1st, is the conversation of Diem with Lodge. Pentagon Paper number 60 is 3 weeks later. Kennedy is dead, Diem is dead, and Johnson has given the order in Pentagon Paper number 60 for covert and clandestine agents and armies to begin the war in Laos. 3 weeks later. This is the anniversary of the exposure of the Pentagon Papers. It is a positive step forward if you use it. It's a tool out of the trap. Wilhelm Reich talks about the traps people are in. If you use this, it is a tool out of the trap. because from February to August, at the time of the Tonkin Gulf, was when the clandestine armies were planning the escalation of the war in Vietnam from February. Kennedy was dead, buried the first of the year, and they were to begin escalating. Now this week, when they bungled the getting caught in the Washington office of the Democratic Party, Mr. John Mitchell came out with his cover stories, and he had his usual. He couldn't say that we know these men and they hired by us and so forth. So he has his cover stories, and I broke down the information of this break-in into the contacts these men have into the White House, who the men who were arrested, how they got into the actual hotel, and the denials. Now the denials are interesting. Mr. Mitchell and came right up and said Mr. McCord and 4 other men were not operating in our behalf or with our consent. Now, this is the way the Pentagon Papers read. They denied Mr. McCord right away. Who was Mr. McCord in his dinner suit and his rubber gloves? He was a former CIA agent. He was the chief salaried security coordinator for Nixon's re-election committee. He had a contract to provide the security for the Republican National Committee in Miami. He worked 19 years with the CIA, lived in Rockville, Maryland, was on the payroll of, through May 31 at least, of this particular private investigating firm, and then with the Republican Party. April and May he drew large salaries from the Republican Party. He was the chief of security at the Central Intelligence Agency at Langley, Virginia headquarters. That's who he is. They're denying that they had any responsibility with this man. He had an alias. He worked as Edward Martin, and he was a former FBI radio specialist and Central Intelligence Agency. There's something very important about this that ties in with Lee Harvey Oswald. When I say Lee Harvey Oswald was in the CIA and the FBI, CIA in Europe, Navy intelligence, 3 years in the Marines, and worked with the U-2 flight and the Navy over in the Soviet Union and FBI in the United States. People don't believe that you transfer the agencies back and forth. James McCord did, and so did Oswald. Mitchell said McCord was not operating on our behalf, and then he went on to say McCord has a number of business clients and interests, and we have no knowledge of those relationships. That is plausible deniability, because they looked up the private investigating firm of Mr. McCord in Maryland. He has no license for wiretapping. It isn't listed as a regular investigating agency. It has a different name. He's violated every law. It has a phony list of directors. His sister-in-law, the directors, were himself and his wife, Dorothy Berry of Houston. Mrs. Berry, an oil company employee, told the reporter that she and McCord's sister knew nothing of the company. She didn't know she was listed as a director. In order to have such a company in Maryland, you have to have 3 directors to be incorporated. This wasn't incorporated. It was listed as a business services studies analysis in connection with business, industry, and academic institutions. The company is not licensed to perform security services, and it's going to do all the security at the Republican Convention in Miami. And it failed.
This information from was printed in the Los Angeles Times.
Yeah, Wednesday, June 21st. And it also failed to file any 1972 income tax with the state. It's a security private agency that's been in business 2 years, that has no income tax, no board of directors, no license, and it's an academic institution. And with all of Richard Nixon's clearances and checking out, he uses the man who is in charge of the entire security of the CIA at Langley,
at the Langley headquarters.
At the Langley headquarters to take care of his election security in Miami.
It does make you wonder a bit. It's another one of those that makes you wonder a bit.
Then there is another thing that I'm going to throw out, because I've described past assassinations, Phil, and predicted future. I think this could very heavily tie in with my theory that Nixon was going to be killed. You see, there's a group of people that do not like Nixon's policies, and one group are the anti-Castro Cubans, he did not invade Cuba the past 4 years and go after Castro. And William Buckley and family are for Ashbrook. They don't like Nixon. And it seems that the man responsible for hiring Accord came through William Buckley and Richard Helms through a Mr. Hunt. And Buckley is tied into a chain of command here. If it's guilt by association, you give it any name. But it's interesting that the anti-Castro Cubans and a few 2 Democrats were in this office. And I'm just playing around with the idea, and by next week I'll maybe do one whole show on the real meaning of the breakdown of these men and the cast of characters, who hired and their aliases and who they were, because I have it all here and there's time's running out. But
do you think these guys intended to be caught? It seems awfully dumb of some people who would, break into the Democratic National Headquarters to bug it and then end up getting caught by the Capitol Police.
No, I don't think they intended to be caught. You see, one of the top men in charge of security at the Watergate Hotel, and that's where John Mitchell lives, don't forget, and these men, Mitchell is running Nixon's campaign, and these men were hired for the security of the Nixon campaign. One of the men who guards the security at that hotel went to bed that night and was ill and conveniently disappeared. And they're looking for him because he didn't guard the door that should have been guarded. And who does Mitchell know? Who do you know at that hotel who had the guard get ill and just turn away the night that these guys break in? But there's a very serious kind of possibility that I'm thinking about, because I did say on one of the shows during the year that the motive for killing Nixon in Miami would be an anti-Castro Cuban. I'd have to look up which show that was up. And, it was one of these where I said that they have to always have a patsy, and this would make sense in Florida, that because he didn't invade Cuba at the time of Bay of Pigs, they would do it. This man also was in charge of the entire Bay of Pigs operation, too, that one of the men that was arrested at this hotel. But what you could do, you could get Democrats, 2 of these men were Democrats from Miami, into the Nixon office, talking about killing Nixon, and have the tape recording come from the Democratic headquarters that there were plans to kill Nixon. And they could be sitting in that room talking about that. If Nixon's killed by an anti-Castro Cuban, you would tie it in, just like they tried to say that Oswald was a communist and killed John Kennedy when actually the anti-Castro Cubans were involved. But you could twist this to get, just like the Berrigan thing was a fake, trumped-up thing to get them on a conspiracy trial. Anderson had an article this week about how it was contrived and fake to lock them in and hope the jury would believe it. It would be possible to get a tape recording from inside the Democratic headquarters of some so-called, in quotes, Democrats talking about killing Nixon, where the anti-Castro Cubans have planted the devices and their agents are sitting there to cover their involvement a second time. I know they were involved in killing John Kennedy. So they could kill Nixon if they wanted to escalate the war in Cuba and take over for the gambling interests in the syndicate. So Richard Helms and Buckley, and there's a bunch of high-up people that are connected with the men. The cast of characters briefly involves Mr. McCord and Al Wong. He's the head of the Secret Service. This is another thing that makes me worry about Nixon's life, was he was the head of the Secret Service Technical Security Division, and he hired Mr. McCord. So the Secret Service that is in charge of protecting the president hires anti-Castro Cubans to protect him in Miami when the anti-Castro Cubans were involved in killing Kennedy. And Nixon hasn't invaded Cuba, and I wonder, are they setting Nixon up? Now, Mr. Wong can't be reached to see how long he was with the Secret Service. See, that's another problem, is how long was he there? Because the man in charge of protecting John Kennedy was only with the Secret Service just a very short time before Kennedy was killed. Instead of bringing in an old-timer who knew all the tricks, and Texas was the most dangerous place to be, they had Lawson of Secret Service, who was chief of Secret Service, who had barely been there since Kennedy was president. He had just started. A Robert Bennett, the son of Senator Wallace Bennett from Utah, has a dummy campaign committee, he admitted, after this arrest, to raise money for the re-election of President Kennedy. He has a public relation firm, and 2 of the people from his firm that worked for him were in that hotel bugging the offices of the son of the senator from Utah. Senator Wallace Bennett, his son, has an office which is another phony office. This is how the CIA, the method they work. He has an office of re-election Kennedy, which he turns out is a dummy committee. There's so much in the paper about the funding of the Republican Party, where the money's coming from. Douglas Caddy is one of the 5 men worked, and he is he's a lawyer for the 5 men that were caught, and he's the liaison between Bennett's office. Well, we're going to summarize. Phil tells me it's time to summarize today's program. What I've really tried to say, it's the anniversary of the Pentagon Papers. And I hope by now that everyone who's listening for a whole year to these shows or on and off has bought the papers and read them. If you haven't, read them. Read how the government plans overthrows or changes of government. If you read nothing else, read the planning of the overthrow Diem. Then you know how your senator or president is killed. You read the language and you know how the system works. Read the notes, read about Tackwood, the conspiracy from the national down to the state level to the criminal conspiracy section, and read your newspapers on the articles of the breaking into the Democratic office. There's going to be a lawsuit, and this is going to continue. And I'll close with one letter I got from Germany from Mr. Weisenthal. He looks up old Nazis, and I still think Kissinger's a Nazi. And I got a letter back that he says, I believe you made an error. As far as we know, Mr. Kissinger certainly is Jewish. Still, as a child, he came to the United States from Germany, which by then was already under Nazi power. And he never denied his being Jewish. I didn't say that Kissinger denied it. I think he's using it as a cover. He said, according to my conviction, there's no possibility that Henry Kissinger is a Nazi. I'll just wander completely right-wing and say they still have some more work to do. The fact that he says he's a Jew doesn't mean he's not a Nazi. He came over here not as a child. He came as a young adult, and the next year was in military intelligence for the United States and back over in Germany. And I worried his family was written up in the Chronicle recently as having a lot of possessions they brought over from Germany and furniture and apartment of their German possessions. And the year he came, you didn't bring those things out of Germany. So I just wondered how he got here. But we covered a lot of territory, Phil. It's an interesting time, and there's just so much happening that it's hard to wind it all into one thing. It's all has to do with conspiracies, right?
Right. You've got a lot of information there. If you got any questions, you can write Mae Brussell. That's who's been speaking. Mae Brussell, political research specialist. This has been Dialogue Conspiracy.